I recently published an article that compared the media's Russiagate affair, the protracted years long effort to quote unquote prove that Donald Trump had colluded with Russia in order to interfere with and influence the 2016 election. I compared that to Vietnam. And that is because it really is a turning point for the American media. I think, of course, we can't look at it in isolation. There was a real context there, high politicization of the American political landscape. Of course, in the midst of it all, we had the rise of the BLM movement, the killing of George Floyd, America set ablaze along racial lines, and then, of course, COVID. But this was still something that stood out amid all that noise, which is really quite remarkable. And we really saw it quite early on. So I wrote this article for The Spectator. The title of the article is Why Russiagate Was the Media's Vietnam. And early on in the piece, which you can go check out that piece, but what I noted was that in the New York Times, Jim Rindsberg, previous media columnist, wrote, "Let's face it, balance has been on vacation since Mr. Trump stepped onto his golden Trump Tower escalator last year to announce his candidacy." Among the questions that Rindsberg said his colleagues in the media were asking, I wrote, were, do normal standards apply? And if they don't, what should take their place? That's a great question. And it's also one that's striking in the fact that Rindsberg would pose it at all. Why would normal standards not apply? Was this truly the rise of a authoritarian figure? And if it was, then how did anybody know that in the early days of the Trump presidency? That's something, or excuse me, before Trump was even elected. So these are the questions that were already being posed by the media stepping into the Trump years. What came after was even more remarkable. It was proving that normal standards do not apply. And the danger there, of course, is that you might argue, yes, Trump is a despotic figure. Yes, he did throw away decades or centuries of political convention or practice or whatever you want to say. And maybe it's true. But when you start to make exceptions for a political candidate or a political office holder, as was done with Trump, that can easily spread. And it can spread not in the direction that the media hopes it would spread, which is to say, we on our side of the political spectrum reserve the right to make this exception for candidates we find problematic. What ends up happening and what is happening is that the other side begins to pick up the same tool and say, well, our standards are not going to apply anymore. And then you have what we have ended up with in this case, which is an entire media who has said objectivity, neutrality, a dispassionate approach to the news is no longer the point. It's no longer even something that we want. It's no longer desirable. It is just weakness. We are now in a phase where media is an extension of politics and politics is an extension of war. That's a bad place for us to be as a society. Back to my piece. What I focused on is a Columbia Journalism Review article that came out in late January that is 26,000 words long. And it was really quite remarkable. It still is. I recommend you go check it out. It's 4 parts in addition to an editor's note. And I believe it's called Looking Back on the Trump Coverage, or it's called something like The President versus the Press. The editor's note is called Looking Back on Trump Coverage. Just to get you started on that, and again, this is at cjr.org, and I highly recommend it. The editor's note is by CJR's editor-in-chief, Kyle Pope, who writes that 7.5 years ago, journalism began a tortured dance with Donald Trump, the man who would be the country's 45th president First dismissing him, then embracing him as a source of ratings and clicks, then going all in on efforts to catalog Trump as a threat to the country, which Pope notes was also a great source of ratings and clicks. No narrative did more to shape Trump's relations with the press than Russiagate. The story, which included the Steele dossier and the Mueller report, among other totemic moments, resulted in Pulitzer Prizes as well as embarrassing retractions and damaged careers, to say the least. And what we find, though, I think more than this, and this is what is borne out by the entire piece by CJR, and that was written by Jeff Gerth, a former New York Times investigative journalist, is that the media didn't just change their standards. That would have been one thing. What we saw with Russiagate is that the media threw all the standards out the window. And journalists ended up doing things were just outright crazy. Like Franklin Foer, who is now at The Atlantic, at the time he was writing for Slate, sending drafts of his articles about Trump to Fusion GPS. This was, of course, the kind of half political oppo research agency, half PR shop. I'm having a hard time describing it because it is such a weird phenomenon in the world today. I'm sure there is a better name for what they do. I just can't find it. But Foer is sending drafts of his Slate articles about Russiagate to Fusion GPS, who had fed him this information and who was being paid by the DNC and by the Hillary Clinton campaign. That is really weird, to say the least. But it's also sort of the least of the issues. I mean, we have the New York Times pushing out big stories that it was willing only to publish, according to Dean Baquet, its executive editor at the time, if there were appropriate amount of details. And then these stories lacked any details, and they just made big sweeping claims about Russiagate that were never corroborated. I have noted in the past the Russia bounty story that the New York Times pursued, which is that Russia was paying the Taliban bounties to kill American troops in Afghanistan. And of course, the kicker here is that Trump knew, or so this narrative went. That was never true. It was not true. The New York Times ran various iterations of that article or mentions of that storyline on numerous occasions over the course of well over a year. And when the story was proven out to be false, it just quietly slipped into the night, as it often does with the media. What I think I would end with saying is that Russiagate, that term, initially referred to supposed collusion, collaboration between the Trump campaign and the Kremlin to elect Donald Trump to the presidency in a way that actually mattered. What it really refers to now, looking back, is, I would say, probably the biggest media debacle, failure, scandal, whatever you want to call it, of the 21st century to date. That is a big and a bold claim, but when you look at the body of evidence, and I would really say, again, go read the Columbia Journalism Review piece by Gerth. Try to read all parts of it if you can, and if you can't, then go read my piece at The Spectator, which is sort of a condensation of it, and you'll understand just how sprawling, how malfeasant, how corrupt this effort was by and large. Of course, not totally. There's always exceptions, but for the most part, that's what it was. And I'll just end here by reading a last paragraph or two from my own piece, which is to say that by this analogy, that analogy being that this is the media's Vietnam, the moment that you can't really come back from because it's so damaging to the institution. So by that analogy, Jeff Gerth's piece in CJR is the Russiagate's version of the Pentagon Papers. Pentagon Papers, of course, being the secret history of the Vietnam War that the Department of Defense had written, telling a very different story than what they had actually pushed onto the American people publicly. So I write here that there is a crucial difference, though. When the Pentagon's secret account of the Vietnam War was published, it had a major impact on America's understanding of the conflict and was seen as a boon, not only for journalism, but for democracy. Gerth's independent history of Russiagate has, by contrast, been treated as an unseemly hindrance, with the press largely ignoring its publication. As Gerth himself notes in the piece, only a dozen out of the 60 journalists he reached out to spoke to him, and not a single major news organization made available a newsroom leader to talk about their coverage. That's a quote from Gerth's piece. While the media extols the virtue of journalistic sunshine, it seems that on Russiagate, it has chosen to hide its failings in darkness. Strangely, it will now fall on the American people to pull the press out of the quagmire, just as it fell to the people to get the military out of Southeast Asia. The question we face, however, is when the troops of journalism finally return home, if they do, is whether they'll ever be fit to fight again. I think it's an important question, and I say that because we need a healthy, thriving, competitive media press for our country, for any society to function and to prosper and to advance. Whether we have that at the moment, I think, is uncertain, but we are seeing, I think, the rise of something new, which is a new approach to media, a diversification of the media, something new replacing the old. So follow me on YouTube and Twitter. That's where I do most of my public stuff. And I'll talk about that idea, the idea of decentralizing media in more depth and detail. Thanks.